Hello everyone, I am Tacet, and today I'm going to be going over all 11 of the negative stats effects that are currently within Gems of War. With recent additions such as Magnus and Voice of Orpheus, I figured it would be a good time to finally go over these, as I have not done a comprehensive video encompassing all of these stats effects. For all the details that we will be mentioning, everything will be in the description below, typed out if you want to reference it for later, or if you just wish to read that instead. But let's get into it. Some things that you should know about status effects that are just general for all of them is that all status effects, with the exclusion of poison, have a 10% cumulative chance to cleanse per turn. So for example, the first turn there's a 10% chance it will cleanse them off, then a 20%, then a 30%, and it just keeps going up and up until it eventually hits a percent that will just automatically occur, such as at 100%. Generally they only last till about 50% or so, but do keep in mind that replacing a status effect onto a troop will reset its timer back down to 10% per turn. So let's say it's already at 30%, 3 turns have gone by, and then you put another status effect on it, it will go all the way back down to a 10% chance on the following turn that it will cleanse them all off. Of course, the easiest way to get things cleansed is simply to use a troop that has a cleanse ability, particularly troops that have the capability of cleansing all allies is the best way of getting negative status effects off of your troops. One other thing to note is that anything with impervious does have immune to every single status effect, all 11 of them, as well as any future status effects that are added to the game. So impervious is quite potent against these kind of mechanics. So it generally, if you're seeing something like a Magnus or some kind of other troop that is very similar in placing a lot of status effects, you would generally want to have at least one impervious on your team, if not more, to be able to counter that out, to make sure that they would have full negation to that kind of effects. So the other thing that should be mentioned is whenever a troop does a status effect on its ability, is it does the damage before it does its ability. So for example, or the negative effect. So for example, if we have a troop, let's say like Glitterclaw, which does damage to a random enemy, and then does Faerie Fire. Well, it does the damage first, and then it does the Faerie Fire. It will always do the damage before the effect of whatever it may be. This is also quite notable in the case of Corvash. If you go and use Corvash's ability, which does both true damage as well as a stun, it'll do the true damage before the stun. So if you're trying to stun out, let's say, the Drake Rider, which has a 100% chance to revive, and you end up killing it with a Corvash, if it wasn't stunned prior, even though Corvash does have a stun, it will still get the revive because it does the damage prior to the stun effect. So do keep that in mind. Every single status effect is like that. The damage is calculated before the actual effect itself. So keep that in mind. So anyways, let's get into all 11 of them, what they look like, as well as just what they do. So first off, we have Burning. It does 3 damage per turn. It can cause lethal damage, and it will only remove barrier once the armor is depleted. So for example, on this troop right here, it will end up removing barrier if it was to have the positive status effect of a barrier, because it's doing HP damage. Whereas in the case of this troop, it's a little bit hard to see, but it has 6 armor right there, and through the burn, it will not remove a barrier. If it had it, it would just do the 3 damage to its armor instead. Also, you can tell a burn simply by this yellow and orangish fire that is on either the shield, or if the shield is completely depleted, on the HP, and that's how you identify that one. Death Mark can be identified with the 2 little scythes that are over top of a troop. These 2 scythes indicate that there is a 10% chance per turn that the enemy will simply die that's inflicted with this effect. Do keep in mind that this has a 1-turn delay automatically, and if you keep applying this onto troops, it will keep resetting the 1-turn delay, similar to how you keep resetting the cleanse chance. So on the very first turn, it will still have a 10% cleanse chance, but a 0% chance to kill. Then on the second turn of a Death Mark, it'll have a 20% chance to cleanse, and then a 10% chance to kill, and then a 30% chance to cleanse, and then a 10% chance to kill. The 10% chance to kill is always consistent. It's one of the few things within the game that can't instantly kill, though the fact that it has a 1-turn delay makes it pretty bad, because if you re-Death Mark a Death Marked enemy, you do reset that 1-turn delay, making it quite useless at this current moment in time. Though when it instantly gets a kill, then it's quite useful, but it's not really a status effect that is often used due to how inconsistent it is, and it is really, really luck-based. Next up, we have Disease. Disease is a little bit hard one to see. I believe they're going to be modifying it in the future. It's basically like this kind kind of fire-looking thing. It's making a little bit of smoke. It's almost impossible to really see with how many we have at the moment. But what Disease basically does is it halves the mana accumulation that you would end up getting. So, but this is only from the board. So if you end up taking this purple pair, it would only give half as much, that much mana. I say that only on the board because things that do cast-related abilities that passively give it to your own team will be able to still do that. So for example, a enchant, which gives 2 mana per turn, will not be mitigated at all by the Disease. It will still give the full 2 amount. Similarly, if you have a troop, let's say like a Dwarven Gate, which gives 5 mana to all allies, the full 5 mana will still be given to Disease troops. Disease is a little bit weird right now. It's pretty useless, generally, mainly because it only works on the board, and it doesn't work for all of these other smaller effects. Not to mention, it's basically like half a silence, and most people would just use a silence instead of a disease. It's, actually, Magnus is the first thing that was added to the game that does have the viable disease, other than Plague, of course, but generally it's a pretty bad effect. If it can only inflict one troop with a disease, you might as well not even use any troop that has that mechanic. Next up is Entangle. It can be identified with these 2 little like vine-like things, green vines that are over top the troop in an X shape, similar to the scythes except in vine shape. Basically what this does is it reduces a enemy's attack to 0 for its duration. It also prevents the attack stat from being increased as well as decreased. So in a way, something like a Leshy troop, that common which entangles everything including your allies, can sometimes be beneficial because if the enemy has a lot of attack reductions, you will not be able to actually lose your attacks while entangled, which is a kind of interesting effect. Of course, you can also use this against the enemy for when they have a attack buff to make sure they can't get those attack buffs, and of course you can use it against skull spam to make sure that they have no damage. Do keep in mind when they get 4 times or 5 times matches, they can still trigger their effects. The way that Entangle works on skull effects, let's say a troop has the ability to burn when they take a skull. When they take a 3-pair while entangled, this will not actually cause the burn, but if they take a 4 times or 5 times, it will still cause a burn because they're still inflicting damage. So if we took this purple down and we got those skulls, we would still inflict that status effect if we were to have had one in first slot, simply because we're still doing damage. The effects that hit on skull are dependent on doing any amount of damage, and unfortunately Entangle does not actually negate against that, nor does reducing something to all the way to 0 attack. Other than that, we have Faerie Fire. Faerie Fire has 50% more damage inflicted whenever it's done via spells. This is one of the most powerful stats effects at the moment. It can be identified with this little green fire that you can see that is always on the HP value, if I'm not mistaken, as you can see right there, as well as in the other one. This is very, very potent since you can cast spam a lot easier than you can skull spam, particularly with how the current meta is set up in this game. Cast spamming is very, very powerful at the moment due to there being no spell mitigation or anything like that. So yeah, 50% additional spell damage, one of the strongest ones. It's mainly placed at this current moment in time with things like Glitter Claw and Queen Titania. Not too many options as it's a relatively new mechanic, so not too many things actually have the capability of doing it. Next up is Freeze. Freeze is also a little bit hard to see. I believe they're modifying this next patch. Also, do keep that in mind in general. A lot of these visuals may be changed in the future. I believe next patch will be modifying a few of them to make it a little bit easier to tell what each one is. But Freeze are these like little icicle things that you see coming down from the troop right there. You see a bunch of them constantly coming, like little triangular icicles. Freeze has probably the most complicated negative effect in this game. It does a lot of things. Essentially what it's trying to do is prevent the enemy from gaining extra turns, and it has 3 different conditions. If the troop normally has a extra turn capability, let's say a goblin that automatically gains an extra turn whenever it casts, if it is inflicted with Frozen, it will lose its turn. It also will lose a turn based on the colors. Let's say, for example, right now we have froze the enemy on green. So if it was to take a 4 times green pair from this board, it would lose its turn. But if it was to get an extra turn of any other color, since it's not frozen on those, it would be perfectly fine and still gain those turns. Also, if the first troop on the opposing team is frozen, it will also give the effect of freezing the skulls from being an extra turn. So if it was to take this purple and then throw that into the skulls, if this first slot was frozen, it would not be able to gain its extra turn. So those are the main 3 conditions that it really runs off of. It becomes pretty obvious once you kind of start getting used to it, but initially it can be a little bit annoying because it's kind of hard to follow sometimes. But basically, just know that whatever colors you're frozen on is basically what you won't be able to extra turn off of. But yeah, it's based on that. If they have an automatic capability, and if the first one's frozen, it will freeze their skulls. It's something that you get used to after a while, but the full thing is in the description if you want to reread through it, because it is the most complicated of any stats effect currently in the game due to it having the most conditions. And as long as one condition is met, it will automatically lose the turn. One thing to do keep in mind though is, let's say we were frozen on purple right now, but we are not frozen on skulls. If we were to take this purple down, we would actually still gain an extra turn because it only froze us on the purple. It didn't actually freeze us on the skulls. So if you take a non-extra turn into an extra turn, you will still get the extra turn, similar to how you would with anything. Like if we were to like take a 3-pair right here somehow to take that purple, even though this 3-pair wasn't an extra turn, those purples coming into alignment would be an extra turn, which would result in us still getting an extra turn. So do keep that in mind as well. So Hunter's Mark, somewhat similar to Faerie Fire, except it's with skulls. It will do 100% extra damage afflicted whenever skull damage is done. One other thing to note about this that is slightly different than spell damage is when you do explosions or destroys the skulls, this will also end up doing additional damage. So for example, if we were to use a Gorgoltha right now and we hit like 12 skulls, because there's quite a bit on the board right now, that would end up doing 24 damage to this troop. This is somewhat useful when actually doing it against enemy Gorgolthas, because you will be able to do more damage through the skulls that you destroy with a Hunter's Mark on the Gorgoltha than you would simply from taking the skull itself. It's a little bit weird. Basically anything with Stone Skin plus, as far as resistance, like 50% plus skull mitigation, tends to be better just to explode them when they have a Hunter's Mark than it is to simply take the skull due to the additional damage that you would get, because mitigation doesn't actually stop the exploded ones or the destroyed ones, and it still gets boost ratioed at 100% for double based on the Hunter's Mark. It looks like those little red crosshair things that you see going over it. Pretty generic crosshair thing. You can see it right there, the little circle, the little inner thing, the little crosshair. You guys know what a crosshair looks like. But that. Poison. Poison is unique in that it is the only stats effect currently in the game that does not automatically cleanse off. If assuming the opposing team does not have any cleanse on their team, a poison will last for the duration of the entire battle, which is quite unique in that it is the only thing that does have that capability. Basically what it does is a 50% chance per turn to do 1 true damage, meaning that their HP will just go down by 1. 50% per turn on that. It can do lethal damage, meaning that it will die if it does take the last little bit of damage off of the poison. It can also remove barrier, so it's basically a 50% chance per turn to remove barrier, since it is hitting that HP directly. And it can alternatively be used as a positive stats effect as well, which might seem weird that a negative stats effect can be used positively, but basically any troop that has a trait that triggers whenever they get damaged, for example Humility, gives +2 armor and +2 magic to all allies whenever it takes HP damage. Well, if that gets poisoned, there's basically a 50% chance in exchange for 1 HP that it will give 2 armor and 2 magic to all allies, which is quite a bit better than the 1 HP that he would have had, especially since he's giving it to all allies. You're basically gaining 7 additional durability and 8 additional magic across your entire team simply for taking 1 single HP damage. So there are instances where poison can, weirdly enough, be both a positive and a negative stats effect. It's quite unique in that. For the most part, it's not really used too often later on in the game. The main kind of teams it gets ran with, if it's actually being purposely used, is with true damage teams, because you can use that to basically tick them down over time, since you can combine a bunch of things that directly hit HP and basically completely ignore the armor altogether. Next up is Silence. That's this little circle over here that it would normally be over the mana location. Silence prevents a troop from gaining any mana. It also prevents them from casting. One other thing to note is that it doesn't completely negate out that mana from being accumulated. So for example, let's say we were silenced on our green seer here, which uses purple and yellow. We would still be able to accumulate those colors. So if we were to giant spider into a bunch of purple, even though she's silenced on purple, we will still be able to accumulate our purple mana on both of our other troops that are open to be able to gain those manas, assuming that they still have mana that can be accumulated. So it doesn't necessarily, like, it's not like a freeze in that it completely denies out your capability of doing it, but it is, it's slightly different in that you just can't get it on that one troop, but you can still get it on all the other ones. So simply being silenced on that color doesn't mean that everything is incapable of gaining that color, only that one troop is inflicted with it. Next up is Sun. This is pretty straightforward. It basically just prevents traits from being used. It can be identified by 2 different ways. It's really weird in that it does have 2 different little icon things. It has this little swirly thing that you see going around with a bunch of like almost blade-like looking things, those little orange ones that keep circling there. It can also be really easily identified by the X's that go over all 3 of the traits. Even if the troop doesn't have those traits, it will still, I believe, show all 3 X's as if they were there. But yeah, basically what stun does is just prevents traits from being used. Do keep in mind that this has no effect on traits that trigger automatically at the beginning of a battle. For example, this has a construct bond, which ended up giving all constructs to life at the beginning of the battle. This does not get stunned, so us stunning it didn't undo the life that it gained because it triggered this at the beginning of the battle and then it just stays. So us stunning this did absolutely nothing, but things like gain 1 magic for each green oh wait, never mind, that's another one that would oops, I read that wrong. But yeah, this would also have no effect when being stunned because it triggered at the beginning of the battle. It gained 1 magic for every single green ally on the team, which was 4 because I had 4 loyalties here, which means if we stun it, it will not lose its 4 magic that it had. It will keep that even if we stun it. But what would be negated are things that trigger based on certain things during the battle. So for example, this has all allies gain 3 armor and life whenever an ally casts a spell. While it is stunned, it will no longer be able to trigger this, and this applies to every single trait that would trigger during the actual battle. But anything that triggers right at the beginning of the battle will not be denied with a stun, so do keep that in mind. And lastly, we have Web. Web is basically the inverse of Entangle, though slightly weaker. Web basically just reduces the magic for its duration down to 0 of whatever is inflicted. This doesn't necessarily negate out the entire ability. So for example, with something like a giant spider, its magic does depend what the spider spawn will what it will be, the level of it. So us being completely denied, it will only summon a level 1 spider. But even though we're webbed with 0 magic, we would still be able to transform a selected mana color to purple and still able to get that actual spider summoned. So a web doesn't really do much to a lot of troops. It's mainly just used to mitigate some of the damage that would otherwise be done through casting. But that's about it. Also, similar to Entangle, any troop that is webbed is not capable of gaining nor losing magic. So that can sometimes be helpful, though more often than not, it's obviously going to be pretty bad to be webbed. It's not anywhere near as good as something like a Silence or something like that, but it is a way to slowly mitigate down damage. It's particularly good against troops that hit all enemies for full AoE or are really magic-based in whatever they're doing. If a good majority of what they do is via or boosted based on their magic, then Web could be a good alternative for taking them out. But anyways, guys, that is all 11 of the stats effects currently in Gems of War. As I mentioned, all of them can be found in the description below as far as what I just mentioned. So if you still have any questions about them, definitely feel free to leave it in the comment section below, and I will definitely make sure to go over them. Also, do keep in mind, as far as I mentioned too, visuals may be changed in the future, so there could be some discrepancy in the visuals I just went over. So there is a chance that they could be completely different than what they currently are now. But anyways, yes, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them below. Hope this was helpful, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week. Goodbye, everyone.